Chapter 21 of The Story of Ancient Irish Civilization. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Story of Ancient Irish Civilization by P.W. Joyce. Chapter 21. How the people held great conventions and fairs, and how they amused themselves. Public assemblies of several kinds and for various purposes were held all through Ireland. They were considered very important, and were looked forward to on the several occasions with great interest. Affairs of various kinds, some affecting the whole kingdom, some the particular province or district, were transacted at these meetings. The laws were, when necessary, publicly recited to make the people familiar with them. There were councils or courts to consider and settle such matters as the claims of individuals to certain privileges, acts of tyranny by rich and powerful people on their weaker neighbors, disputes about boundaries, levying fines, imposing taxes for the construction and repair of roads, and such like. In fact, the functions of these meetings of more than 1,000 years ago were in many respects like those of our present county and district councils. In all the assemblies of whatever kind there were markets for the sale and purchase of commodities. Some meetings were established and convened chiefly for the transaction of serious business, but even at these there were sports and pastimes. In others the main object was a celebration of games, but advantage was taken of the occasions to discuss and settle important affairs, as will be described farther on. The three great assemblies of Tara, Croghan, and Emain were not meetings for the general mass of the people, but conventions of delegates who represented the kingdoms and sub-kingdoms, that is, the states in general of all Ireland, and who sat and deliberated under the presidency of the supreme monarch. The word feish was generally applied to these three meetings. The feish of Tara, according to the old tradition, was founded by the Olam Fodla, Olav Fola, who was the king of Ireland 7 or 8 centuries before the Christian era. It was originally held every third year at Samain, that is, 1st November. The provincial kings, the minor kings and chiefs, and the most distinguished Olavs, doctors of the learned professions, attended. According to some authorities, it lasted for a week, that is, Samain day, with 3 days before and 3 days after, but others say a month. Each provincial king had a separate house for himself and his retinue during the time, and there was one house for their queens, with private apartments for each, with her attendant ladies. There was still another house called Railta na Villa, the star of the poets, for the accommodation of the Olavs, where these learned men held their sittings. Every day the king of Ireland feasted the company in the great banqueting hall, which was large enough for a goodly company, for even in its present ruined state it is 759 feet long by 46 feet wide. The results of the deliberations were written in the national record called the Saltaire of Tara. The conventions of Emain and Croghan were largely concerned with industrial affairs. The Éanach or fair was an assembly of the people of every grade without distinction. It was the most common kind of large public meeting, and its main object was the celebration of games, athletic exercises, sports and pastimes of all kinds. The most important of the Éanachs were those of Tailten, Tlachtga, and Uisneach. The fair of Tailten, now Teltown on the Blackwater, midway between Navan and Kells, was attended by the people from the whole of Ireland, as well as from Scotland, and was the most celebrated of all for its athletic games and sports, corresponding closely with the Olympic, Isthmian, and other games of Greece. It was held yearly on the 1st August, and on the days preceding and following. Marriages formed a special feature of this fair. All this is remembered in tradition to the present day, and the people of the place point out the spot where the marriages were performed, which they called Marriage Hollow. The remains of several immense forts are still to be seen at Teltown, even larger than those at Tara, though not in such good preservation. The meetings at Tlachtga and Uisneach, which have already been mentioned, seemed originally to have been mainly pagan religious celebrations, but there were also games, buying and selling, and conferences on local affairs. At the Irish fairs, wherever held, all kinds of amusements were carried on, for the people loved games, sports, and fun of every kind. In order to make sure that there should be nothing to spoil sport, there was a very strict law against brawls, quarrelling, or fighting. Any one who struck a blow or raised any disturbance was sure to be punished, and if it was a very bad case, he was put to death. So if there were any grudges between individuals or families or clans, they had to be repressed during these meetings. The old Greeks had a law for their games exactly similar, which they called the sacred armistice. An Irish fair in those times was a lively and picturesque sight. The people were dressed in their best and in great variety, for all, both men and women, loved bright colors, and from head to foot every individual wore articles of varied hues. Here you see a tall gentleman walking along with a scarlet cloak flowing loosely over a short jacket of purple, with perhaps a blue trousers and yellow headgear, while the next showed a color arrangement wholly different, and the women vied with the men in variety of hues. The people were bright and intelligent and much given to intellectual entertainments and amusements. They loved music and singing, and took delight in listening to poetry, history, and romantic stories, and accordingly, among the entertainments and art performances was the recitation of poems and tales of all the various kinds mentioned, like the recitations of what were called rhapsodies among the Greeks. For all of these there were sure to be special audiences, who listened with delight to the fascinating lore of old times. Music always formed a prominent part of the amusements, and there was no end of harpers, timpanists, pipers, fiddlers, and whistle players. In another part of the fair, the people gave themselves up to uproarious fun, crowded round showmen, jugglers, and clowns with grotesque masks or painted faces, made hideous distortions, all roaring out their rough jests to the laughing crowd. There were also performers of horsemanship, who delighted their audiences with feats of activity and skill on horseback, such as we see in modern circuses. In the open spaces around the fair green there were chariot and horse races, which were sure to draw great multitudes of spectators. Indeed, some fairs were held chiefly for races, like those of the Curragh of Kildare, which was as celebrated as a racecourse 1200 years ago as it is now. Special portions of the fair green were set apart for another very important function, buying and selling. There were markets for stock and horses, for provisions and clothes, and there you might also see foreign merchants from continental countries exhibiting their gold and silver articles, their silks and satins, and many strange curiosities, all for sale. Embroidering women, all natives, showed off their beautiful designs, and often kept doing their work in presence of the spectators. A special space was assigned for cooking, which must have been on an extensive scale to feed such multitudes. At length the leaders gave the signal that the Eineach was ended, and the people quietly dispersed to their homes. Hunting was one of the favourite amusements of the Irish. Some wild animals were chased for sport, some for food, and some merely to extirpate them as being noxious. But whatever might be the motive, the chase was always keenly enjoyed. It is indeed quite refreshing to read in some of the tales a description of a hunt and of the immense delight the people took in the sport and all its joyous accompaniments. The hunters led the chase chiefly on foot, with different breeds of hunting dogs, according to the animals to be chased. The principal kinds of game were deer, wild pigs, badgers, otters, and wolves, and hares and foxes were hunted with beagles for pure amusement. Pig hunting was a favourite sport. Wolves were hunted down with the great Irish wolf dogs, some of which were as big as a colt or an ass. Wild animals were trapped as well as chased. There was an elaborate trap for deer, a deep pitfall with a sharp spear at the bottom pointing upwards, all covered over and concealed by a braflang, or light covering of brambles and sods. There was a special trap for each kind of animal, wolf, wild hog, otter, and so forth. Birds were caught with nets and cribs, and indeed bird catching was considered of such importance that it was regulated by a special section of the Brehon laws called bird net laws. Fish were caught, as at present, with nets, with spears either single or pronged, and with hook and line. Fishing wires on rivers were very common. A man who had land adjoining a stream had the right to construct a wire for his own use, but according to law he could not dam the stream more than 1/3 across, so that the fish might have freedom to pass up or down to the wires belonging to others. Coursing was another amusement, as we find mentioned in our literature. The dogs were pitted against each other, and it was usual to see greyhounds, trained for this special purpose, exhibited for sale in markets, like cows, horses, and sheep. Hurling or goaling has been a favourite game among the Irish from the earliest ages, played with a ball or a cayman or hurley as at present. In the latter part of the last century it declined somewhat in popularity, but now there is a vigorous attempt to revive it. Our modern cricket and hockey are only forms of the old game of cayman. In ancient Ireland, chess playing was a favourite pastime among the higher classes. Everywhere in the tales we read of kings and chiefs amusing themselves with chess, and to be a good player was considered a necessary accomplishment of every man of high position. In every chief's house there was accordingly at least one set of chess appliances for the use of the family and guests, namely a checkered chessboard with chessmen and a bag to hold them, which was often made of woven brass wire. From the most remote times in Ireland, kings kept fools, jesters, clowns, and jugglers in their courts for amusement, like kings of England and other countries in much later times. In the tales we constantly read of such persons and their sayings and doings. They wore funny-looking dresses, and they amused the people something in the same way as the court fools and buffoons of later times, by broad, impudent remarks, jests, half witty, half absurd, and odd gestures and grimaces. King Connemara's three jesters were such surpassingly funny fellows that, as we are told in the story of the Derga, no man could refrain from laughing at them, even though the dead body of his father or mother lay stretched out before him. Professional gleemen, commonly called croissants, travelled from place to place, earning a livelihood by amusing the people like travelling showmen of the present day. There were hand jugglers who performed wonderful tricks of sleight of hand. King Connemara's head juggler and his trick of throwing up balls and other small articles, catching them one by one as they came down, and throwing them up again, are well described in the old tale of Da Derga. He had clasps of gold in his ears, and wore a speckled white cloak. He had 9 short swords, 9 small silvery shields, and 9 balls of gold. Taking up a certain number of them, he flung them up one by one, and not one of them does he let fall to the ground, and there is but one of them at any one time in his hand. Like the buzzing whirl of bees on a beautiful day was their motion in passing one another. End of chapter 21. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.